Hello everyone and welcome to New Type Advantage. Today we are taking a look at how to paint a gold metallic dragon. This model is from Lord of the Print, an amazing 3D sculptor on Patreon. Makes some really amazing models. This is the ancient gold dragon from a set from a couple of months ago, and I finally got around to painting it for my D&D campaign. I couldn't find very many good tutorials on how to paint a gold dragon using mostly an airbrush. A lot of them out there were much smaller models and using traditional painting techniques with brushes, so I wanted to take a shot at going through the process on how that would look using an airbrush. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. First up, as with any model, you want to prime it. I also gave it a quick zenithal highlight, which ended up being absolutely worthless. But here I am painting it with Mr. Hobby's Metallic Gold. It's an acrylic paint from their Acrision line. I sprayed this over the entire model, except for the wings, because I ended up running out of paint. So I had just enough to cover this main body, and I realized along in the process it was not as vibrant of a gold as I wanted. So here on this wing I started experimenting with a combination of Vallejo Game Colors polished gold and glorious gold, mixing them in a 50-50 ratio. I ended up liking that color a lot better, and I had a lot more of it available to use. It gave a lot more of that intense gold color that the gold dragons are known for. So I mixed up another batch of that and sprayed it over the entire top of the model, almost giving it like a gold zenithal highlight. So the underside of the dragon ends up being a little bit paler gold than the top part of it. It looks for a really cool effect. Now here I'm going in with the Vallejo Metal Color Aluminum. Even though gold dragons in D&D are not commonly depicted with having a different color underbelly, I thought it made for a much cooler contrast. It looked way cooler having a secondary color rather than just complete solid gold. So I went in with the Vallejo Metal Color Aluminum and sprayed that over the entire underbelly of the dragon. And after doing the entire underbelly of the dragon, I then switched to the Vallejo Metal Color Jet Exhaust to paint over the horns, tail, and kind of the larger spiky areas on the model. I wanted yet another color to give some extra contrast, even though again it's not commonly depicted for gold dragons. They're usually just a solid gold color. I really wanted that extra contrast, and to see if I could paint the entire dragon using only metallic colors. Alright, now here I started to paint the membranes of the dragon. So the different membranes on the head, tail, and wings I started to paint using a combination of Vallejo Game Color, Brassy Brass, and Glorious Gold. So I went in on all of the large membrane areas, the ones that were a lot easier to hit with an airbrush, and filled in and blocked out those large spaces of color. And it was around this time that my airbrush was giving me a little bit of trouble, so I went quick, finished up this wing here, and then I transitioned into more traditional brush painting. Now, here we are at the painting desk, and I first did two little dots of white on the dragon for the eyes. This is going to help get the green eyes that I'm looking for later. It's going to be a lot easier to paint over the white compared to just the straight gold. Now, since my airbrush was giving me a lot of trouble, this is where I went in with that 50-50 mix of Brassy Brass and Glorious Gold, and I painted in all of the membranes. So I went over all of the large membranes that I couldn't get a good coverage on without a lot of overspray, and then all of the smaller ones that my airbrush just couldn't really effectively get into. I went in and I filled in all of the membranes with two thin coats of this Brassy Brass and Glorious Gold mixture. I did this along the entire neck, back, and tail of the model. covering each one of the membranes with 2 coats. Now, here is where I went over again and painted over the horns and claws with more of the jet exhaust color, getting a little bit better coverage in some of the areas that I couldn't quite reach with the airbrush without some massive overspray. So I went in, covered the larger spikes, the tail, the claws, went over the horns, as well as parts of the wing. Now, it's important to remember that when you are doing this, especially for camera, make sure that you get as much of your hand as possible in frame, and also paint 90% of it off screen so nobody knows what you're doing. Alright, now here I went in with Citadel's Tesseract Glow, and I covered the eyes. I did 2 thin coats of Tesseract Glow to get a very nice vibrant green color for the eyes. And here's where I realized that I had made a pretty major mistake with the model. So, as you can see, I painted the major parts of the model separately. What this led to was I didn't really do any proper test fitting after printing the model. So, as a result, I realized at this stage that there were some major gaps between the wing pieces and the main body. And as a result, I just kind of said, screw it. I need to throw caution to the wind and glue it together. I don't recommend doing this unless you do some major test fitting first, because ultimately I ended up having to go back and do some major gap filling. And doing gap filling after you are this far along in the paint job sucks. So remember, folks, if you are building models, especially multi-piece models like this, make sure to test fit first. Had I caught my mistakes and caught these major gaps, I probably would not have gotten this far along in the painting process. So, learn from me. Don't do gap filling after you have about 90% of it painted. Alright, now after recovering from my mistake that I realized that I had made, not test fitting the pieces, I then moved on to painting the base. The base was done very simply with just dry brushing, various tones of gray on it. I started with a dark gray over about 90% of it. Then I went over it with a lighter gray, and then after that I went over it with an almost pure white, just to get some nice variation in the tones. It's a pretty easy technique just to dry brush stone. It gets you a very good effect. That's why with the base I primed it in black and didn't do any zenithal highlighting. The dry brushing really brings out the cracks and the tones of the stone texture. Then I moved on to just quickly stippling a gold on there. For this I just used the straight Vallejo Game Color polished gold over all of the gold coins that were on the base. I did it fairly sloppily because it's just meant to be massive piles of gold. After that, I went in and did a little variation, painting various silver and copper coins in the piles. So there are just some various silver and copper coins, just to add a little bit of extra variation. After the coin painting, I went in with a mixture of black and brown washes. They're just a easy homemade wash recipe, but I dotted those along the various parts of the base to bring out some of those extra shadows and details, and I did that over the entire base, stippling and kind of varying between, like I said, a black wash and a brown wash to give the stone a little bit of extra interest and more color than just bland gray. And here's the part that I dreaded most. Here I'm going in doing the gap filling. So as you can see, I'm going in with some Milliput to fill in some of those large gaps that I realized there were from the 3D printing process and me not test fitting properly. So I mixed up a little batch of Milliput, and I am putting that into the various gaps in very, very small, tiny little Milliput snakes. I'm trying to avoid really just smearing it all over the model, trying to minimize the amount of paint correction that I have to fix later on. So I'm just trying to really keep the snake's little tubes of milliput nice and thin to fill in those gaps. Like I said, don't make the same mistake I did. I thought by keeping it in separate pieces, it would make it a lot easier to paint, and technically true. Unfortunately, because the model, the wings specifically didn't fit together very well, I now have to go back in and do some gap filling. So after doing the gap filling on both wings, I then ended up waiting for that to dry, which takes about a day. And the following day, I went in with my polished gold and glorious gold mixture and just painted over that by hand, leaving us with the final product, a very shiny and very amazing gold dragon from Lord of the Print. Like I said, this was one of the bigger models that I've painted, not the largest that I've painted so far, but one of the biggest ones. And like I said, I really like to use my airbrush for models this large, so I wanted to give it a chance to try and show you at least my process on how I went about painting my gold dragon. So thank you guys very much for watching. I will leave you with a few kind of glory shots here showing off my finished paint job. And if you liked the video, I would greatly appreciate a like, comment, whatever you feel you want to leave. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.